Testing. All right. Gotcha. All right. Hello, everyone. It is time to begin. We'll start with the word of prayer and then we'll get into our class. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for this time to come together and study your word. Thank you for those that are present here today. Be with those that might not be with us at this time, so that they might be able to be with us at the next time we gather together. Thank you for the encouragement that coming together brings, and pray that our time together might not only be encouraging to each other, but also glorifying to you, Father. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Hosea chapter 8. That's where we're going to spend our time. Now, here in Hosea chapter 8, we're entering into a new section, but it's also related to what has come before. But what we begin to enter into is where the author of Hosea is once again calling attention to the fact that God's people are about to endure, or already are enduring, through a time of suffering because of their sins against God. And now we see this in the opening verse where the text says, "Put the trumpet to your lips, like an eagle the enemy comes against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law." Now, I want to ask here, we've run into this image of a trumpet before. What was the purpose of a trumpet in ancient times? Okay, sounding a battle cry, so that is on the right track. Yes, it functioned as kind of an alarm of sorts, and we talked about this imagery of alarm before. So, according to this verse, what's about to happen? Why is this trumpet being sounded? Okay, that's true. An encounter. Okay, so what does the text tell us about what this trumpet is for? Just right there in the verse, right in front of us. What's coming? An enemy is coming. Now, what's that enemy compared to? An eagle. Okay, so these are some pieces to this verse that we have. So, yes, this trumpet, it's referring to an alarm being sounded, and we have this image of an eagle. Now, this word eagle would probably be better translated as vulture. And the reason for that is because in the original Hebrew term, it's applied here to say that something bad is about to happen to this house of the Lord. Now, the house of the Lord, when we see that term, we usually think of the temple or the tabernacle, and that's true, but here it's being used in reference to God's people. It's just another one of many terms we've run into in this book that are used to talk about God's people. So the point being made in this verse is that a time of great difficulty was coming upon God's people. Now, according to this verse, why? Why is this time coming? What have God's people done? They've transgressed this covenant. Jeremiah, is your hand up? Okay, that's also true. That's the ultimate result. Is that God is coming, and yes, the trumpet was used to announce the coming of the Ark of the Covenant. But that is the ultimate result. God is coming in judgment, because that's what this book is about. God's coming in judgment for the reason stated here. They've transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. So it's all about them rebelling against God is why these things are being allowed to come. So, any other questions or comments on verse 1? Okay, good. Okay, that's true. Yeah. And in a manner of speaking, they are, because sometimes the imagery of death refers to separation from God. So, yeah, spiritually speaking, they are in fact dead. So, this eagle or vulture is coming. So, as a result of these things, we read in verse 2, they cry out to me, my God, we of Israel know you. So, we have this image of crying out to God. Now, what does that mean to cry out to God? To ask for help, yeah. So here we see this plea for help. Now, what's the claim they're making? We know you. Now, what does it mean to know God? Okay, so that's on the mental aspect of it, but what else is involved with knowing God? It's relationship. So here, God's people, they're going through this time and they're now, at least at some point, they're going to turn back to God, but they're making this claim, God, we know you. That idea in this context is we're in a relationship with you. But, verse 1, they've transgressed covenant, they've rebelled against his law, so that's showing they're not in that relationship, but even though they might claim to be in that relationship, because at this point in time, their mindset is God is just one of many gods. Exactly. Right. Exactly. So that's their mindset. But they're forgetting God doesn't want to be one of many gods. He is the true living God, as Andrew put it. Go ahead. Exactly. So this still goes on today. So there's nothing new here. And nothing new under the sun, Solomon would say. So it's these things that set the stage about God's people about to endure suffering that is elaborated on in verses 3 through 10 of this chapter, where two reasons are given as to why God's people are going through this. Now, in these verses, they're going to be referred to as Israel. Again, just one of many terms. So in verses, there's two reasons given in verses 3 through 10. The first reason we'll explore in verses 3 through 7 is that Israel suffered because it had rejected the good. And the second reason we'll explore in verses 8 through 10 is that they suffered because they had been swallowed up by the nations. That's the language we'll be running into. Now, again, the application will be that our suffering sometimes comes for very specific reasons. We'll talk about that when we get there. But let's read verses 3 through 10, and then we'll look at the points. Again, this is Hosea chapter 8. The text says, beginning in verse 3, Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue him. They have set up kings, but not by me. They have appointed princes, but I did not know it. With their silver and gold they have made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off. He has rejected your calf, O Samaria, saying, my anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For from Israel is even this, a craftsman made it, so it is not God. Surely the calf of Samaria will be broken to pieces. For they sow the wind, and they reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads, it yields no grain. Should it yield, strangers would swallow it up. Israel is swallowed up. They are now among the nations like a vessel in which no one delights. For they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey all alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Even though they hire allies among the nations, now I will gather them up, and they will begin to diminish because of the burden of the king of princes. Okay, so a lot of information here, but we're looking at two reasons Israel suffered, and number one is because they had rejected the good. Verse 3 establishes that point right out the gate. And again, the text says Israel has rejected the good. Now, from the context, let's ask this question: what is the good? God. There's no other logical answer. Now, why refer to God as the good? Exactly. So it's talking about, yes, God being pure good, but also giving what is good to his people. Now, this term good, it does refer to what is pleasing in the eyes of God. But the point being made here is that Israel has rejected it. Now, what does it mean when you reject something? You throw it away. You turn it down, we might say. So they've done this. What's going to happen in the second line of this verse? The enemy will pursue them. Him. Yes, you're right. Not them, him. So who's the him? God's people. So they're going to be pursued by some enemy. Now, the text doesn't specify what enemy is being spoken about. This could be a physical enemy, but I also want you to consider that this enemy in this context could be God himself. Now, why would that be true? Okay, he's beating them into submission. Exactly. So Israel is in opposition to God. And when you're in opposition to someone, that someone is your enemy by default. So they're going to be pursued by God. And the way that's going to happen is through this eagle vulture people coming that we talked about back in verse 1. Questions or comments on verse 3? Right. That is true. So you have the word spurn there? Okay. Okay. Makes sense. Yeah. That's, yeah. Right. That has been true. Yeah. That's true. Some people do get hung up on that. Anything else on verse 3? All right, well, let's go to verse 4. Now, going on into verse 4, we begin to run into, again, to some of the things that Israel had done. And one of those things is that they had set up kings, but not by me, is what that first line. And then it goes on from there. So we're coming back to the royalty idea. So, what has Israel done in this verse, according to verse 4? That's part of the idea here. They didn't take God into consideration as they appointed their rulers. So there's basically the idea, well, we don't care what God thinks, we're just going to set up this king. And then princes is parallel to that. But what else have they done according to this verse, aside from kings and princes? They made idols using silver and gold. So they did all these things, but they gave no consideration to what God thinks. The result of this, okay, based on the end of the verse, is that they might be cut off. What does it mean when something is cut off? Separated. So what is Israel cut off from? From God. This is the theme that's running through this. So they've done all these things. The end result is that they're going to be cut off from a relationship with God. So, in a manner of speaking, Israel's brought to an end in that respect. Questions or comments on verse 4? All right. So, with verse 4 being the case, in verse 5, we find a warning that God has rejected what the text calls Samaria's calf, where God says of them, the text says, "My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence?" So we run into this word rejected again. What has God rejected? Okay, but what's the text say? 5, yes. Okay, so we have this calf. Now, what do we think of when we think of a calf in the Bible? Okay, sacrifices, but what happened earlier in the Bible? The golden calf. They've done this again here. Now, it doesn't say golden calf, but it just says calf. But this calf is being set up as an idol, just like it did back in Exodus under Moses' day. So God is angry. And he's asking this rhetorical question, how long will they be incapable of innocence? Now, what do we think of when we think of innocence? Not being held accountable. You're not guilty. So it's the opposite of being guilty. So part of their guilt is they've set up this calf and worshiping it as an idol is the idea here. And so God is angry. He's asking, are they ever going to be innocent? Again, that's the idea. Anything else on verse 5? Okay. So verse 6 continues the thought. For from Israel is even this, the text says, a craftsman made it, so it is not God. Surely the calf of Samaria will be broken to pieces. This continues the thought that our minds might go to back in Exodus. Now, what happened to the calf back in Exodus? That's it. It was broken to pieces, as the lamb put it, ground up, put in water, and then, yes, they were forced to drink it. Now, if that's what the writer has in mind, part of the point being made here is that this calf of Samaria was going to suffer the same fate as the golden calf of Exodus. It's Exodus chapter 32 where we read that story. The calf was burned up, ground to powder, and then everything Elaine said happened. Again, we read that whole story in Exodus 32. Same thing is going to happen to this calf of Samaria. Now, who made the calf? Man, a craftsman, the text says. So since it was from man, it's not from God. So what we're part of the picture being painted here is that goes back to that first statement, for from Israel is even this. God, for the lack of a better term, his mind is blown that his people are doing this. And we see some of this in the New Testament. But idols, one thing they have in common is they're made by man. Idols are not ever made by God. And this is why idolatry is so confusing, again, for lack of a better term. Idolatry is you're worshiping something that was obviously made by man. But that first statement, for from Israel is even this, is like, why? God's people are doing this, but they should not. So again, those are just some thoughts. Anything else on verse 6? Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah. It's true. Well, it's not even always statues. This little thing I have in my pocket, this can become an idol. If this becomes more important than God. Paul says over in Colossians that greed, the love of money, is a form of idolatry. So there's all kinds of examples, but here we have one. This calf that Samaria built. Uh-huh. I only have splinters, but you have better footnotes than I do apparently. So, yeah. Anything else on verse 6? Okay. Verse 7. Verse 7, the author of Hosea goes on to give a reason that these things are going to happen, and we run into these images of a wind and whirlwind. But again, this is a reason, and the verse 7 makes the point that because Israel and Samaria were doing the things described in verses 5 and 6, they were creating for themselves suffering. And what was going to suffer here in verse 7? You have flour there? Okay. Um, well, I don't have that, but that's okay. I just have yield no grain. But when we think of grain and stuff, what's going to suffer? Their fruit, their crops, we might say. Their crops were not going to produce, but the end of the verse says, should it yield or should it produce, strangers would swallow it up. So their crops weren't going to produce anything, and if it did, foreign people were going to take it from them. And all because they have chosen to worship this calf-like idol from verses 5 and 6, among other things. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verses 3 through 7 of this chapter about why Israel suffered is that Israel suffered because it had rejected the good. They had rejected anything God wanted to give them that was good. How do we know that? They set up leadership with no input from God. They worshiped this calf-like idol, regardless of what God thought. And since they had done these things, among other things, their crops would suffer and be taken from them by foreign people. That brings us into verses 8 through 10, the second reason Israel suffered, and that's because they had been swallowed up by the nations. We see that right there in verse 8. It says, Israel is swallowed up. They are now among the nations like a vessel in which no one delights. Now, what does it mean to be swallowed up? Eliminated. That's exactly the idea here, because the phrase swallowed up, it does come from a word that carries with the idea of being destroyed or defeated. Now, who are they defeated by? Israel. Okay, that's the what, but the who is defeating them here in verse 8. What does the text say? Other nations, other peoples. So again, this is this battle imagery. Other nations are coming in to destroy them, and they're being viewed as this vessel in which no one delights. Now, what's a vessel? A container. So this picture is being used, and how is, if Israel's this container, what's their relationship with these nations? What does the text say? It's a vessel in what? Which no one delights. What does it mean to delight in something? You value it. That they're a useless vessel? Okay. So yes, it's still the idea that Israel's being viewed as not having any value. So all the people around them are looking down on them, is the picture being painted here. So with that being true, in verse 9, the author goes on to give a reason that Israel's in this condition, which is because they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey all alone, and Ephraim has hired lovers. Before we go there, anything else on verse 8? Okay. So here in verse 9, what has Israel done? Where have they gone? For what reason? What are they looking for? Okay, that's true. Okay, so that's true. Who should they have gone to? God. So they're just digging themselves deeper and deeper, but instead of going to God for help, they're going to these other nations. They're compared to this wild donkey all alone, and Ephraim has hired lovers. So they're going to all these places for help, but they're not going back to who they should be going to God. Now, this picture of Ephraim having hired lovers, it's prostitute kind of language. But God's people are prostituting themselves out to other people instead of remaining faithful to God. Questions or comments in verse 9? Okay. So verse 10, the concluding verse of this section, says, even though they hire allies among the nations, in other words, even though they're going to other people for help, what is God going to do? He's going to gather them up, bring them together. The result being that they would shrink in number because of what the text calls the burden of the king of princes. So this idea of God gathering them up is destroying them. And we see that in the fact that they'd begin to diminish. But another question we have to ask here is what this burden of the king of princes is about. Now, this seems to be a financial burden that had been placed on the leadership of Ephraim and Israel as a result of doing what is described for this verse. They had hired other nations. Now, when you hire somebody, what are you doing? And what do you have to do when you hire someone? You have to pay them. So this is why this burden of the king of princes might be a financial burden. Because the king has hired these other nations, he's obligated to pay them. So being that this is the case, then Israel's people were going to shrink in numbers simply because they had made the choice to seek help out of their suffering from the nations around them. Weren't able to pay these other nations that they hired to help them. So as a result, they're going to be destroyed, and they are going to shrink in number. Questions or comments on verse 10? Okay. Exactly. Exactly. So their suffering is going to get worse because of these choices that they've made. Anything else on verse 10? Okay, putting all these things together, the point we should see from verses 8 through 10 about why Israel suffered is that they suffered because they had been swallowed up by the nations. They're in a state of suffering. Part of the reason for that is because of their relationship with the nations around them. They were looked down upon. And this relationship only added to their suffering. But even though this is the case, even at this point, they still didn't turn to God for help. They're still going to these nations for help, like Assyria. And this causes God to somehow bring his people together in a state where they've diminished in number as a result of their own choices. So the point we should see from verses 1 through 10 of this chapter in Hosea is that Israel was in a state of suffering. Why? Because they had rejected the good, and they were swallowed up by the nations. So the application to us is that sometimes our suffering comes for very specific reasons, sometimes because of our own choices, and especially when those choices are made in opposition to God. As a result of these things, even if and when we are in a state of suffering, we must turn to God for help and seek his wisdom to make sure we are making choices that are in accordance with his will. Again, these are just some applications. Anything else on what we've studied today? Elaine? Absolutely. Right. Exactly. That's part of the reason Paul says over in Galatians,